Welcome to another Zoom webinar from the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. My name is Daniel Smith. I am the Gerald L. Curtis Visiting Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University. And I am very excited to welcome this evening or in morning time and joining us from Japan, Professor James Raymo from Princeton University. He is a professor in the Department of Sociology and also the Henry Wendt III Professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. Previously, he was Professor of Sociology at University of Wisconsin-Madison and has his PhD from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor from 2000. Today, Professor Raymo will be speaking about demographic issues and family and inequality in Japan. The title of his presentation is the Family and Inequality, Diverging Destinies in Japan. And Professor Raymo will speak for about 40-45 minutes. If you have questions, for those of you joining us live, please submit your questions through the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. And I will moderate those questions near the end of the talk. So without further ado, Professor Raymo, we are ready for you whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dan. Before I share my slides with you all, I'd just like to say thanks to Dan for the invitation. And I can't see anybody, of course, but thank you for coming. I hope the topics that I am going to share with you are of interest. It's really a pleasure to be able to present in a venue like this, even if it's on Zoom. Of course, I would rather be there with you all, but since that's not possible, let's treat this as a second best. I really enjoy being able to present the work that I do. Of course, there are many opportunities to present to other sociologists and demographers, but I think I get the most out of both in terms of great questions and comments, but also just in terms of enjoyment from the talks that I give to interdisciplinary groups who have a very deep substantive knowledge of Japan and East Asia more generally. So I look forward to any thoughts that you may have on what we're doing and any feedback that you may have. I'm a family demographer. So that's what I do, and that takes me in a lot of different places, but I'm not expert in many of them. So I will really look forward to hearing what you have to say about how the work I'm doing fits into some broader issues that you all may be interested in. So with that, let me share my screen here, and I will make sure that, Dan, does that look okay?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, great. So I will jump right in, and I will do my best to be good about the time. As Dan said, the title is Family and Inequality, which is very straightforward. And I'm going to present a lot of information about family behavior and various aspects of social and economic inequality in Japan. Diverging Destinies, that is jargon, but I will explain what we mean by that. And I think it's pretty clear, and hopefully I can make a good case for all of you that there is relevance for thinking about how this notion of diverging destinies, which, as I will describe later, is something that came out of research on the US, may or may not be relevant for helping us understand social change and its implications in the Japanese context. So let's see. Oh, hang on. Too fast. Okay, there we go. I want to start with just a little bit on inequality before getting into family and inequality. So you can see what this is. These are headlines about the new Prime Minister Kishida's platform involving this notion of new capitalism, and particularly the role of income redistribution in that broader sort of buzzword or term. I don't really know the degree to which we might expect action or progress on new capitalism and income redistribution. We can see, but I think the point I want to make is that he thought this was enough of a winning strategy to make this a central part of his platform. And by that, I want to just highlight the notion that concerns about social and economic inequality, growing disparities in a range of different outcomes is something that is central to the broader discourse in Japan, be that scientific, be that policy, be that media, or be that just everyday conversation. This is something that is sort of a central topic. And I think that with this audience, I probably don't need to spend so much time on this, but I will briefly just share a little bit of information about why I think there's good reason to think that concern about income inequality and the need for policies that might address that would be a winning strategy. When I present work like this for audiences of demographers, people who aren't East Asian specialists, Japan specialists, I think people are surprised to see how unequal Japan really is. For Japan scholars, I don't think that's such a surprise, although arguably it might be a surprise to many Japanese people themselves. I think there's a sense that Japan is more equal than it actually is. If you just take a look at data in the various OECD databases, you see that Japan is actually, with respect to income distribution, more unequal than the OECD average. You see that if we look at relative poverty rates, Japan has a higher relative poverty rate than the OECD average, certainly nowhere close to the United States, but still higher than average. And actually, interestingly, in the context of a conversation that I hope to take to a sort of broader East Asian focus, very similar to values for South Korea. So two relatively unequal countries with respect to income distribution and poverty. And I think something that's really interesting to keep in mind, I don't have good data in my back pocket to share with you on this, but I think there's a pretty widely shared understanding that subjective belief in rising inequality and declining social mobility is an issue. So we have both objective indicators and subjective indicators that Japan is becoming a more unequal place. And as I said earlier, this is something that's really kind of front and center in a range of different venues in terms of the broader discussions. Explanations for this are the typical suspects. We're in the third decade now of economic stagnation. We all know about rapid growth in non-standard employment and its implications for inequality in employment stability, wages, and so on. People talk about the tax system and redistribution. Japan doesn't do a bad job, I think, with respect to income redistribution, but it's not, it's not Sweden for sure. A relatively weak social safety net, particularly spending on families, and population aging is another explanation that's sort of near and dear to my own research interests. We know that the older population is the most unequal segment of the population, and as that part of the population grows in size, relative and absolute, then that has implications for overall inequality as well. But what I want to do is to make a case for the role of family bifurcation, growing differences in family behavior being part of a broader set of explanations for rising inequality, not just income inequality, but we'll pay primary attention to economic inequality. This is just a smattering of books, many of which I've enjoyed reading, that make the point, I think, that there is an understanding that family behavior is part of how we should be thinking about trends and explanations for inequality in the Japanese context. There are books here you can see talking about spousal inequality, children's poverty, divorce and children's well-being, single mothers and poverty, and so on. So these are all things that I think are relevant to this linkage I want to try to make between family behavior and inequality. So it's certainly on the radar. I'm going to try to make the point that it's not as prominently on the academic radar, at least not in my discipline, as is the case in the US and elsewhere. Let's see. And when thinking about the US and elsewhere, I want to introduce this notion of diverging destinies. This is a term that was coined by a former colleague here at Princeton, Sarah McClanahan, unfortunately has recently passed away, one of the absolute giants in family demography. And in the later part of her career, really spent a lot of time developing this notion of diverging destinies and linking family behavior to inequality. I'm going to explain this in more detail, but I just want to sort of give you the background here, where this term came from. And I should note that Sarah was, as I said, like probably the leading expert on family behavior, children's well-being, and inequality in the US. And I mentioned, I think at the outset, that this notion of diverging destinies emerges from the research that she and others did on the United States. Got a little bit of a delay here, sorry, hang on, there we go. And is that right? Oh, here's what that didn't look right. So here's what I want to do first, is to give you a stylized representation of what diverging destinies is all about. So I mentioned this notion of family bifurcation, and this is what this completely made up hypothetical figure depicts. So on the horizontal axis, you have time, just some random measure of calendar time. And on the vertical axis, you have the percent of people experiencing some family event. Let's just say divorce, or let's say non-marital childbearing, just for the sake of example. And we have three different groups. We'll call them low SES, low socioeconomic status, red, middle socioeconomic status, and high socioeconomic status. And the basic point here is simple. At some point in the not so distant past, the prevalence of this family event, divorce, non-marital childbearing, whatever, was relatively low. And socioeconomic differences were not pronounced. Yeah, maybe the low SES group had slightly higher prevalence, but you can see at point zero, time zero, the differences aren't that large. But over time, we observe growth for all groups in the experience of this event, say non-marital childbearing, but the growth is faster as you move down the socioeconomic spectrum. And you get this fanning out, this bifurcation, where you have progressively larger chunks of the low SES population experiencing this event vis-a-vis the higher SES groups. And the key point to think about here is that these family behaviors are family behaviors that either theoretically or empirically are linked to children's resources. That can be money, it can be time, parenting quality, environment, whatever. Resources that we think are relevant for children's well-being. That's diverging destinies in a nutshell, okay? And as this bifurcation occurs, you have a corresponding bifurcation in resources with implications for those children's destinies, hence the notion of diverging destinies. And in this literature, I'm not going to spend more than just a couple of seconds on this slide because I'll come back to this idea later. In this literature, there are any number of family outcomes that have been examined. And the key point to stress here is that these are all, as I just said, family outcomes, family behaviors, family transitions that we think or we know are related to children's resources. So early versus late childbearing, for example, single versus partnered motherhood, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, did I skip one? Yeah, I'm having a little problem with my keyboard here, sorry about that. So let's think about diverging destinies in the Japanese context. How relevant should we think that this framework for understanding linkages between family behavior and inequality developed in the United States, a very different context for a range of different reasons that I think we're all pretty familiar with. How relevant should we think this might be in the Japanese context? Well, just by way of background, in the areas of work that I do, sociology of inequality, demography of inequality, I read in the economics of inequality, there's tons of research on socioeconomic differences in family behavior. Hundreds of papers on how people at different points in the socioeconomic spectrum behave differently with respect to these different behavior, family outcomes of interest, and how they may have changed over time. But as I said at the outset, I think there's been little attention to how we think about those connections and those relationships in some kind of broader comparative framework like Diverging Destinies. And this is what I hope that I and my colleagues are bringing to this broader discussion. And we've thought a lot about why this may or may not be relevant in the Japanese context. And there are very strong reasons to expect that Diverging Destinies, this is largely irrelevant to the Japanese context. And I would argue that one main reason for that is gender inequality. We all know where Japan and Korea fall on things like the Global Gender Gap Index and many other probably more relevant measures of gender inequality. It's a very gender inegalitarian society, arguably the most gender inegalitarian of the wealthy countries. And why this is relevant is that in that context, this notion of socioeconomic bifurcation in family behavior is a little bit harder to think about if you don't have the same kinds of bifurcation in employment opportunities for women. You don't have the same kind of growing differences in the opportunity costs, for example, of leaving the labor force, depending on whether or not you have a college degree or not. In that context, I think there's a lot of reasons to think that the Diverging Destinies ideas may be of little relevance. And historically, that's probably true. Mary Brenton and others have written on this idea that one of the defining features of the family life course in Japan, at least through the 1970s, was its homogeneity in terms of timing and in terms of the absence of any meaningful socioeconomic differentials in family behavior. Sure, there are differences, but they were pretty minor relative to other countries. So having said that, I think there are also very strong reasons to expect that Diverging Destinies may be of tremendous relevance in the Japanese context. One is the relatively weak social safety net. This has to do with the ways in which family behaviors like divorce are associated with economic disadvantage and hence the resources available to children. I'll come back to this later, but I think we might expect Diverging Destinies to be more relevant in a society like Japan than in a society like Iceland or Norway or something like that. And more importantly, perhaps, is the rapidly changing labor market. I've already mentioned the growth in non-standard employment and bad jobs. I'll come back to this a little bit later as well, but to the extent that increasingly we see people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, different educational qualifications, sort of being funneled into these different career tracks, we may think that there's some relevance for this pattern as well. And related to that are increasing economic opportunities, employment opportunities for well-educated women. Yes, it's true that the majority of women still leave the labor force at around first birth. And yes, it's true that many highly educated women work part-time for much of their lives. But it's also true that there are growing opportunities for highly educated women that are not available for those at the lower end of the distribution that look a lot like what we might see in the US and elsewhere. So this is just a little bit of background. I'm sure you all can think of other reasons why we might think one way or the other. So this is just to note that this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. This little, I don't want to call it a book. It's not a book. It's a pamphlet, maybe. It's a working paper with a fancy cover, in which we examined several of these outcomes: marriage, divorce, early childbearing, bridal pregnancy. That's a term we use to refer to what we used to call shotgun marriages in the US. For those of you who do work on Japan, you know that bridal pregnancy or dekichatta kekkon is huge in Japan, a very common pathway to first marriage, and so on. And this is work that I've been doing for years and will continue to do with colleagues at a range of different institutions listed here at the bottom. And I promised one empirical example of this, the stylized graph that I gave you earlier. This is an example that comes from that working paper I just showed you. And what we have here on the vertical axis, the family behavior of interest, is the percent of women who whose marriage involved pregnancy. They were pregnant when they got married, bridal pregnancy. And you can see that that's gone up for all groups over time. These are women born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And we have 5 educational groups. Ignore the blue, please. That junior high school graduates, we know this is a tiny and shrinking group that's very, very unusual. Let's focus on the red and the gray, high school and vocational school, versus the yellow and the black, junior college and university. And you can see almost no difference for women born in the 1940s. But by the time we get to women born in the 1970s, we really see this fanning out. And to the extent that bridal pregnancy is associated with earlier marriage, unplanned pregnancy, perhaps less stable marriage, all of these things are things that we think theoretically or empirically may be related to children's resources. So this is why we are interested in this. So some evidence consistent with this general pattern of change. Here's another one. I'm working on a paper with a postdoc at Oxford right now and several colleagues in Japan. And basically what we're trying to do is to describe change and differentials in pathways to marriage, first marriage in Japan. And I hope this graph is striking. It was striking to us, and we study this. So I hope this is interesting to you. But basically what we've done here, these are marriages that took place in the 1990s to about 2015. So we've got about 25 years of marriages here. So I'm not looking at time change here, but just educational differences, high school, junior college, university. And what we've done is to take all first marriages in this period to these groups. So these bars sum to 100%, and we've broken them down by the pathway. So blue is the conventional pathway. You get engaged, you get married, get pregnant, you have a kid. You can see that that's a minority now for the least educated women, and only 61% of highly educated women follow this path. The orange and the gray together are pathways that involve premarital cohabitation, non-marital cohabitation, living together before marriage. And you can see that's 36% for the least educated, 32 for the highly educated. And the yellow and the gray together are pathways that involve pregnancy. So bridal pregnancy, premarital pregnancy. You can see that over a quarter of women in the lowest group are pregnant when they get married, compared to 11% for highly educated women. So this is just a little bit different way of showing you what I showed you in the previous slide with newer data and also folding in cohabitation. I mentioned divorce. We've done several studies on divorce and how they differ by educational attainment of women and men. And I can assure you that the results are all the same. No matter what data source we use, no matter what tools we use, there is a very strong negative educational gradient in divorce. This is a recent study or actually an ongoing study with a former student, a student at the University of Wisconsin who will soon be an assistant professor. These are just cross-sectional percents of women in different educational groups who have ever divorced. These are all mothers, I should say, there are no childless women. These are all mothers, and this is just a percent of women between the ages of 20 and 65, I believe, or 60, who have ever divorced. A quarter of women in the lowest educational group, the modal educational group, high school, have ever divorced, compared to only 8% for those in the highest education group. Again, I'm not looking at change over time, but I'm showing you that there are very strong educational gradients in one family behavior that we know with certainty to be strongly related to economic disadvantage and children's resources. Excuse me. Here's another one. I mentioned continuous employment. I think we know that stable employment is associated with higher earnings, with better parenting, with lower levels of stress, with a range of outcomes that we think are related to children's resources. We also know that that's pretty uncommon in Japan. Until recently, about 70% of women left the labor force temporarily or longer around the timing of their first birth. But what I have here are the pathways, employment trajectories, if you will, across a 2-year period, 1 year prior to first birth and 1 year after first birth for women, high school graduates, vocational school, junior college, and university. And the two orange ones are stable employment. Dark orange is full-time, full-time, and light orange is part-time, part-time. And the others, the blue, involve leaving the labor force. The gray are a big, kind of mishmash of different pathways. But what we can see here is that 27%, so not quite a third, over a fourth of women in the highest group have stable employment around their first birth, compared to only 15% of women at the lower end of the educational distribution. So again, not change over time, but cross-sectional data consistent with these differentials that we believe to be relevant for diverging destinies. Hang on. Okay, so I'm going to take that information on divorce I just showed you in conjunction with that information that I just showed you on employment trajectories around first birth. And I want to try to understand the extent to which those differences with respect to mother's educational attainment are relevant for understanding differences across the socioeconomic spectrum in different measures of economic disadvantage or material hardship, something that we assume to be directly related to children's resources. So in this paper, what we did, we considered 4 different 0-1 measures, yes or no measures of economic disadvantage. Low income, so poverty level income. Economic need, can't buy clothes or food when you need them. Subjective difficulty, it's hard to make ends meet, or inability to save. People who are either never saving or spending down any savings they may have. And I apologize for the metric here. These are coefficients from a linear probability model, which basically just means that they are percentage point differences between these educational groups and the lowest educational group, high school. So they're all below 0. So these measures of economic disadvantage are all lower among women with at least a 2-year degree relative to those with only a high school degree. And they're large, 17, 15, 20 percentage point differences. The question we want to get at is how much of this difference can be accounted for by the fact that women in higher education groups are less likely to divorce, are more likely to have stable employment around first birth. So when we account for those differences, we get this. About a third of that overall difference is accounted for by these differences in family behavior. So differences in divorce and differences in employment trajectories are salient for understanding children's resources as proxied by these measures of economic disadvantage. There's a lot of other things left. This doesn't explain everything, but the point here that I want to make is that it explains a sizable chunk of this, suggesting the relevance of these ideas that link family behavior to inequality. So let me, I think I'm moving along pretty well with respect to time. So let me switch gears here a little bit and move from measures of family behavior to outcome measures. These aren't measures of children's resources, but they're measures of children's outcomes, which we think are the ultimate thing we're interested in. Family behaviors influence resources, resources influence outcomes. Outcomes are something we can think about as part of the sort of broader social stratification processes across generations. So with some colleagues at Keio University who are collecting some fantastic panel data of children and their parents, we've done a little bit of work. This is also with my former or soon-to-be former student, Jia Wang, where we have looked at differences across socioeconomic groups in children's cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes, well-being. And this is these are results from a simple model where we're using income, household income, as opposed to mother's education as the key stratifying variable. We've got the bottom 25%, so roughly proxy of poverty, middle 50%, middle class, and the upper quartile, excuse me, we might consider upper middle class. These are standardized test scores for math on the left, Japanese in the middle, and a kind of reasoning test on the right. And the mean value for all of these is 0. So below 0, you are below the mean, above you're above, and you can see a very clear pattern. In all cases, children of families in the lowest income quartile score significantly lower in these cognitive tests. Children in the middle are around 0, and children in the highest quartile do much better. So we see this is, of course, true in probably any country you would study. This is not surprising. What we ultimately want to do is to try to link this to the family behaviors, right? But this is what we have demonstrated in this paper. And here's a measure of behavior problems. This is not really my area. If others are experts in this, I'd love to hear more about what you think about the measure. It's called what is it, a strengths and deficiencies questionnaire or something. It's a measure of children's behavioral problems. Higher scores are worse, more behavioral problems. And again, you can see the same pattern. Children of parents in the lower income quartile have much higher scores on this behavioral problem index than do those in the upper group. So nothing to be surprised about here, but let's think about how can we sort of creatively think about the ways in which these differences in family behavior that I've described may be related to these outcomes, may contribute to these outcomes. We've already seen how that works for the measures of economic deprivation, material hardship. Let's take a look at something different, standardized math scores in this particular example. So what I've done here is something similar to the other family behavior slides. The 3 large bars here are the distribution of age at first childbirth. Thinking that early childbearing from all of the literature on the United States and elsewhere is not good for children. It's associated with a range of factors that result in less favorable outcomes for children. An issue that you would certainly want, should come to your mind immediately is, wait a minute, Japan doesn't have early childbearing like the United States. They don't have teen childbearing, and you would be right. So that's why the question is really interesting. Remember, I sort of started out trying to ask, are these ideas relevant in the Japanese context or not? So what we've done here is to create measures of younger, average, and older age at first childbirth that are salient in the Japanese context. So younger is under 25, 25 to 30 is average, and above 31 and above is older. And you can see here that high school educated women are much more likely, 17%, to have a birth before their first birth before age 25 than university graduates, 4%. Okay, and similar differences in older childbearing. That's interesting, maybe not surprising, but what's important here is if you look down at the red here, when we tabulate the standardized math score by these different levels of age at first childbearing, we see that early childbearing, even defined to be appropriate in the Japanese context, 24 and under, is associated with much lower math scores on average for the children in those families, older actually with higher test scores. So this is some suggestive early evidence of our efforts to sort of bring all of this together. So what do we make of all this? I want to just take a minute here to briefly remind you of what I started with. It was a while ago, you may not remember, or there may have been so much in between that you've forgotten what I started with. So let me just reiterate the general motivation for all of this. And that is a recognition that social and economic inequality is a major social and policy focus in Japan. We have high levels of income inequality, high levels of poverty, high levels of child poverty, this shared subjective sense of declining opportunity. And the explanations are primarily economic or policy focused, wage stagnation, growth in non-standard employment, population aging is an exception. But our real contribution is to bring this notion of family bifurcation, developed, as I said, in the United States, a completely different context, but one that I should emphasize, McClanahan and colleagues have argued should be broadly relevant in societies characterized by low levels of fertility and high levels of inequality. So that's the focus. I've talked a little bit about Japan, sort of background data. Japan's a normal country. It's an average country with respect to inequality and poverty. The US is not, obviously. China is not. Many of you may know more about that than I do. But we emphasize that there are some aspects of family behavior that are likely to mitigate inequality, very low levels of non-marital childbearing, almost zero, limited labor force attachment of married women, although we are doing some work on this as well, showing that that's changing. The prevalence of dual earner couples has increased steadily over the past 20 or so years. Little evidence of an increase in assortative mating. So I haven't really talked about that. Assortative mating is also jargon for who marries whom. And in the US context, there is a lot of research on the growing tendency for the well-educated to marry each other and the less educated to marry each other, with implications for bifurcation in household income, resources for children, investment in children, and so on. That's actually not happening in Japan, interestingly, and we can talk more about that if you're interested in more detail. At the same time, there are some aspects of family behavior likely to exacerbate inequality, and I've showed you some of these. High divorce rates, relatively high poverty among single mothers. I didn't mention that Japan has the highest or one of the highest poverty rates among single mothers and children in single parent families in the OECD. And also high cost of child rearing. I think that all of us who study Japan are well aware of the perceived high cost of childbearing and its relevance for understanding marriage and fertility behavior and aspirations in Japan. And one would think that if we're interested in these questions about children's resources and investment in children, these kinds of linkages between family behavior and inequality would be more salient in places where children are more expensive, where it requires more resources for success in highly competitive educational systems and so on. I'm going to skip the last two. Let's see. And let me see, did I skip one here? I'm gonna skip that one too, and just try to wrap up by asking, where are we going to go from here? We've done a lot of work. This has taken years, and there are many more ways that we could do similar work and just keep doing this for ad infinitum. But I think what we're interested in doing is to really try to think about some of the ideas that McClanahan and others have laid out with respect to the generality of these ideas. And I'm working currently with colleagues at Penn and at Peking University to do a systematic overview of the research on socioeconomic differences in family behavior and these kind of linkages relevant to the Diverging Destinies framework in Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan. So that will come out next year, 2023 sometime. And in that context, we're also interested in extending the Diverging Destinies research in two important ways. The Diverging Destinies research has really tended to focus on one thing at a time: non-marital childbearing, divorce, something like that. But what we've done, and I showed you one simple example where we tried to simultaneously incorporate information about educational differences in divorce and stable employment around first birth, to think about the ways in which these different family behaviors that are central to this framework may be part of a package, to the extent that those at the lower end and the higher end are simultaneously engaging in multiple behaviors. I think we may learn a lot more about the linkages between family bifurcation and inequality by seriously accounting for the fact that there are these correlations between family behaviors. And we also want to pay more attention to differences in relationships or returns. So demographers, we focus on composition. And I've given you any number of examples here where I've shown that certain family behaviors are more prevalent or have become more prevalent at the higher or lower end of the educational distribution. And these compositional differences are thought to be relevant for understanding divergence in children's resources. But what we don't tend to talk about much is relationships, or what economists might call returns. So what if it's the case that not only is divorce more heavily concentrated among low-educated mothers and fathers, but what if it's also worse for children? Divorce at the low end of the socioeconomic distribution relative to at the higher end of the socioeconomic distribution. Perhaps those at the lower end of the economic distribution don't have support from parents. So the grandparents of the children relative to those at the higher end. This would be one way in which relationships would be different, and we would want to pay attention to that. And we finally want to spend more time focusing on implications for inequality. We've done a little bit focusing on children's outcomes and linkages between family behavior and children's outcomes, but I think what needs to be done is to spend a lot more time making those linkages explicit and thinking about the degree to which differential family behavior and trends in differential family behavior can help us to understand trends in various aspects of social and economic inequality in Japan. So I think I'm good. I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I always learn a ton whenever I hear your presentations, and this is not an exception. I remind those of you who are joining live in the audience that if you'd like to ask a question for Professor Raymo, you can submit the question in the Q&A function, and I will moderate it and bring it into the discussion. I have a few questions that I'll pose to Professor Raymo to get things started, and a few of them have to do with the last points that you ended on. So it was really great to learn that that's something that you're thinking of. So one question I have is sort of this potential trade-off between the idea of the life events that you're looking at, something like divorce, and whether that might always be a bad thing if the alternative to divorce is something like domestic violence, and in terms of the situation at home and the effects on children. And so I wonder if you thought about that and whether there's data on domestic violence that could be one of the diverging destinies that you could look at. The second related point to your closing remarks is on the intergenerational implications of this. And I'm thinking about with the older generation living longer and longer, but still until recently retiring at the same age. That means a longer amount of time, perhaps being supported by the younger generation, maybe even for lower socioeconomic status households living in the same household, or maybe that's particularly true for middle socioeconomic status household. And that ultimately means that there's less of a windfall of inheritance by the time that the older generation finally passes away. So how does that kind of delayed and reduced inheritance contribute to the widening inequality across socioeconomic groups? And then the third question, I'm wondering if you have any data related to this on the socioeconomic status of the parents. So have things gotten worse? If Japan in the 60s, 70s, 80s had less inequality than it does today, do you have data on the social mobility of current generations? Has it gotten worse? Has the gap widened less for those whose parents are from a higher socioeconomic status, for example, than they are? If there's some way you can get at that, or what your hypotheses might be. Yeah.
So you're testing my memory capacity here with 3 questions, but I'll do my best to try to answer them. So the one is
domestic violence, inheritance, and then the socioeconomic status of parents.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer all of them in the same way that I realize up front may sound evasive, but I don't mean it to be that way, and I'll try to explain why. I think these are all critically important questions, and I think that my initial reaction is that these are all things that people in my discipline or my area of research are extremely interested in and have spent tons of time trying to understand. I think there are 2 ways to think about this. One is that they are not currently explicitly incorporated into this framework of diverging destinies, and maybe should be thought of in a sort of separate context or framework, or maybe should be folded in to this broader framework. So I'm gonna start with that, and I'm gonna answer kind of along the first lines, sort of suggesting. I'm just going to try to answer your questions directly, not in the context of Diverging Destinies, but just as you've asked them. So I don't think you won't be surprised to know that there isn't good data on domestic violence, but there is some data on it, and I think that where we really are able to get at this a little bit is not in surveys or sort of prospective panel studies that ask about domestic violence. That's a survey killer right there. That's a tough question to ask about. But there have been some surveys that I've worked with where there are questions, sort of retrospective questions. Have you ever experienced domestic violence? And you also know whether these people have experienced divorce or other family events. And it's very, very clear, both from those kinds of retrospective surveys, as well as ethnographic research, as well as sort of the data that comes out of NPOs, that domestic violence is one of the most important reasons, or I shouldn't say one of the most, it's a very important reason for divorce in Japan as it is elsewhere. And obviously, growing up in a home characterized by domestic violence is unambiguously negatively associated with children's resources, if we think about high quality parenting and good home environment as a resource. So I think that there's a lot of room for being able to incorporate that in this broader framework, although measurement, of course, is critically difficult. Intergenerational influences. So this is really interesting. I'll tell you a little bit about what we've done, and then I'll go off on a tangent just a bit. In a lot of the work that I've done on the the extreme disadvantage that single mothers and their children face in Japan, is to try to ask, to what extent are the relatively limited public transfers, public income support, and other types of support that would mitigate the economic impacts of divorce, to what extent is the lack of that mitigated by the fact that about a third of divorced women and their children live with their parents? And the answer is not much, because I think there's kind of a mix. It's not as if it's only the low-educated, poor mothers who live with their parents, although it's a little bit higher, but their parents tend to be in pretty bad shape. So we have intergenerational resemblance in economic disadvantage that really is problematic for the mothers who move in with their mothers, the grandparents of their children. Another thing that's, I think, really salient here and comes from a different area is what you were sort of getting at with respect to bequests and so on. And I would argue that a much more interesting, and I would argue probably salient, aspect of this set of ideas is inter vivos transfers. So transfers from what we call in sociology grandparent effects. To what extent does grandparental direct investment in grandchildren have implications for accelerating some of these differences in resources that we see. So I would suggest that that's there. Social mobility. So I don't do a lot of work on this, but there is a survey that you may be familiar with, the social stratification and mobility surveys that have been done since the 50s. And that would be, I think, the place where you would want to go to determine whether or not there are either real or perceived declines in social mobility, upward social mobility over time. I think speculatively,
they didn't survey women until the 1980s.
That's a big problem.
Or 1990s
That's of course a very big problem. Yeah, but there's a large group of people at University of Tokyo, Tohoku University as well, who've been doing work on this for years. And I think the answer to both of those for men is that it has declined, but not as much as you might imagine.
So masterfully answered all my questions.
There's a lot more we could talk about, but I'll stop there in case others have questions.
Yeah, well, I have a few other ideas since we have some time. So the other thought that occurred to me during your presentation, and this is probably easy, and you might have already looked at the data, but I often think of there being two Japans, urban and rural, and the inequality is so much higher in rural areas than in urban areas. So I just wonder if you've looked at the data, or if you could speak to whether the diverging destinies is more pronounced in rural communities than in urban communities, or if not, why not? Why might that not be the case?
Yeah, I can't answer that question, Dan. I would love to answer that question. One of the things that as somebody else who works with survey data, is that national surveys are great for some things. They're really tough to study small groups. So for me, studying single mothers has been difficult, and I've been fortunate to have access to data that has a massive oversample of single mothers that allows us to do this. Rural residents aren't as rare as single, well, it's probably about the same, actually. And I think that the surveys that I work with simply just do not have enough information about rural residents. But I think that would be a tremendously interesting twist to this. I can say that we've done a little bit of work. This is going to take me out on a different limb here and a tangent. You can tell me to stop if it's too far from what you're interested in. But we have done some other work completely unrelated to diverging destinies, but more related to differences, disparities in various aspects of social well-being among older Japanese. And I've tried to examine the degree to which men and women differ, highly educated and less educated differ. And in this one, we have done urban-rural differences and find really little or no evidence at all that older urban residents look any different than older rural residents with respect to these sort of subjective measures of well-being. But these are not children. This is exactly the opposite end of the life course from what I've been focusing on today. So I really don't know, but that would be fantastic to pursue if we had the data.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that having done surveys in Japan, it is always a challenge to get representative samples from not just some urban areas, but even the older the population you're interested in, the harder it is to get data responses from them as well.
Yeah, that's the same thing with the family bifurcation research. Who doesn't answer surveys? Single mothers
People who don't
answer
have
surveys
time.
because precisely. Yeah.
Yeah, who's got the time to talk to a researcher in Princeton, New Jersey, or wherever about their struggles when they're struggling.
I'm a free writer. All of my data come from government institutes in Japan. I haven't collected my own, so free writer. Yeah.
The last question.
Good colleagues. Yeah.
That's a way to think of it. The last question I thought I'd like to ask you about, just to get your thoughts on, is you mentioned a lot of kind of broad demographic explanations for these widening inequalities, the diverging destinies. And being a political scientist, I'm curious about whether you can point to any political explanations or policy other than the tax system, policy, either sources or potential solutions that could be that should be on people's radar for how to address this, and maybe with relevance or reference to the comparative picture, because of course it's not just Japan that's dealing with these issues. The United States is as well, and you mentioned Korea and other countries in East Asia that are of particular interest to you. But what is the solution, and is there a political source to some of the problems?
That's a great question. It's a hard one. We have another hour. Or
3 minutes.
I'll try to do my best. I think it's an interesting. I mean, it's as is always the case in the things that I study, and I'm guessing that you do as well. It's a mix of economic influences, policy influences, and sort of social cultural influences. And I think with respect to the policy and influences, the most obvious one that comes to mind is one that I've mentioned a couple of times, and that is the very limited public income support for single mothers and their children. It's really quite minimal. There are other kinds of in-kind transfers, support that are not minimal, that are relatively more generous, but income is critical. And I think that more that's so the basic policy, I think the policy push is independence through employment for single mothers. And this is where all of these data come from. It comes from the Japan Institute for Labor Policy and Training, trying to evaluate the role of different sort of policy, the policy framework for promoting independence through work among poor mothers. And I think it's pretty clear that it doesn't work. It works in terms of getting mothers to be in the labor force. About 85% of single mothers are employed, but 55% of them are in poverty. So something on that front, I think, is critically important. And I think, you hinted at it a little bit. I don't think that the so-called 1.03 million wall, or whatever it's called in English, that limits the annual earnings for certain groups of married women, low-earning married women, is probably the most important. But I think that there are other sort of, I'm not sure if it's policies, but the intersection of policy and corporate policy and public policy, the intersection there, that really makes it extremely difficult for women to remain in the labor force to the extent that they would like to. I don't know what the policy is to facilitate that. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of work-family balance, more access to high-quality childcare, and so on. But I think, I'm not an expert, but I'm kind of a skeptic, having watched pretty much every possible policy initiative that I can imagine thrown at this, and not really having any of them work with respect to women's employment and fertility. I don't know how to answer that. Yeah. I'm sure that was more than 3 minutes. Sorry.
No, that's great. I mean, I think it's an important puzzle for more research to dig into.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In the political science field, many people have looked at the gender representation in politics, and that when you get more women into political power, then there are more women-friendly policies that get enacted. But if lots of different policies are being tried and nothing seems to be working, then there's maybe a puzzle there that needs more more investigation. But of course, Japan ranks low, as you mentioned, on gender representation and gender equality in general.
One more thing, the policy, just to throw one more, I'll keep it under a minute out there, that comes to mind as you just started talking about that, is policy discussions. I don't know where they went. I think actually the policy was already changed with respect to the incredible gaps between the protections of non-standard employees versus regular employees. And I think that that's a pretty critical aspect of the broader policy environment for thinking about the sets of processes that I've described today.
Right. So, I mean, this just goes to show how important this topic is, and how much the rest of the world can learn from thinking about the case of Japan, which is sort of at the forefront of many of these issues, and not just in terms of the challenges that they face, but in terms of thinking through policy solutions for them. And so I'll just say, as we're ending the time we have this evening, thank you so much for your stimulating presentation. It was really great to have you. And we look forward to one day post-pandemic being able to welcome you to an in-person talk. And
it's
thanks
completely
to
my pleasure. Thank you for having me here. I really, I didn't get to see everybody, but I had a good time talking with you. So,
well, and thanks to those who joined us live, and to those of you who are watching later on YouTube. Thank you for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at future WEAI events. Have a wonderful evening.